Hi, my name's Thete, a Mythic Radiant Retribution Paladin, and this is a weekly update on how Retribution is looking for Legion. I did a really quick one for how it's looking for the PTR, for the pre-patch that's coming out very soon, but I'm going to do this one based on how it is in the beta at level cap. So for those who've been following my channel, of course, they'll know that I'm going to be bringing out guides. I've already brought out one introductory guide for the pre-Legion patch. The other one has been delayed, of course, because Blizzard have made changes. So that's why I brought out the update video. I'm intending to bring out the next guide in the next week and a half. It all depends on if there are more changes. But then I sort of thought I haven't done an update for the Retribution Paladin on the beta as it is at level cap for a little while. Initially that was just because there were very few changes and I thought that was it. I thought Blizzard had pretty much done it. And then they started making changes but at a very rapid rate, and they still seem to be doing that along with tuning. And whenever they do some tuning, it also changes my advice on which talents to take and all the rest of it. So what I've done is, in this particular video, I'm going to have a little look at some very minor theory crafting. First thing to note, I never claimed to be a theory crafter. It's a lot of work in there, and I haven't got the time for all that nonsense with... I don't even know how to code. I'd have to learn stuff like that, and there are people that do a perfectly good job of it for Retribution, a much better job than I would anyway. But I'm just going to do a few little napkin maths and show you that. And it's really from the point of view of dungeons. One question that's often asked, and it's a question I ask myself and I have asked for some time as I went through alpha and then into beta, is what would be a good set of talents to use for a dungeon? Of course, we're all going to do dungeons. Well, maybe not so much PvP players, but even then you'd probably do a few. But this, I do these videos from a PvE point of view mostly. What is a good set to take? Now, the two I'm going to focus on are Crusader Strike and Blade of Justice options. The reason for that, if you look at tier 1, where you would think, at the moment, Final Verdict just seems to be best for everything, but that's a tuning thing. Once it's finished being tuned, you would think Execution Sentence should be the clear single target benefit. Final Verdict, other situations. Consecration is complete tosh. Don't ever use it. Really all depends on, for deciding between Execution Sentence and Final Verdict for a dungeon, is... Final Verdict will surely win out on most trash. Execution Sentence will surely win out on most bosses. So where do you want your focus to be? Do you want to be better on trash, or do you want to be better on bosses? Some people might be sidetracked here and think bosses, because they think, well, those are, if anyone's going to be linking damage meters, it's on bosses. I would personally go the other way, and the reason for this is that when you're considering doing a dungeon that's tough for you, and we're all going to be encouraged to do that in Legion because of the Mythic Plus dungeons. So the way I see it is this. Now, I am not hugely experienced at the very difficult dungeons for that, because the last couple of expansions, the very difficult dungeons, what have they been? They have been challenge modes. And I've not really done much. I didn't do challenge modes at all really in MOP. And I only did them at the start of WoD just to get the gear until I was into raiding. But my perception is that if you're going to come unstuck anywhere, it's on trash. Bosses, people usually treat bosses with more respect than they do trash. People are using their cooldowns for bosses. Everyone's switched on. There might even be some actual communication between the party members. On trash, people tend to be a bit more cavalier. They might pull more than they intend. And in fact, the dungeon footage I've got here, when I went into Dark Art Thicket, that's very much what happened. And this was just a normal dungeon. Also, sometimes to save time, people decide to spend even longer trying to sneak past trash and then end up pulling an extra pack or something like that. So if the shit's going to hit the fan, it's usually on trash, in my experience. I'm not saying that experience is universal. So I am thinking more in terms of, I'd want to set myself up as trash, but at the same time I don't want to be weak on a boss either. So is there something that's nice and halfway house, but if it's got to be one or the other, leaning more towards the trash. So in terms of the Blade of Justice options, we have Virtue's Blade, Blade of Wrath, Divine Hammer. Virtue's Blade does physical damage. So with these damage values, I've tried to account for it for the armor that is, and reduce the damage accordingly as if it were holy. And what I've done, first of all, I've just done a nice simple DPS calculation for the raw damage each of these things do based on the time it does that. So the times I've used for Virtue's Blade and Blade of Wrath are the times that, you know, the cooldown times. But for Divine Hammer, it's the ticking time because it ticks every couple of seconds. And I'm using values that are on my level 110 Paladin. It is not very advanced. I haven't had that much time to play on it since the beta came out, actually, and we had the character wipe. And also I'm planning on leveling up the character copy very soon anyway, because of so I can test professions a bit better. So it's only got 13 traits on the artifact, so it's not at all hugely advanced. It wouldn't take that long to get up to this point. So we can see from those initial DPS values at the moment, Divine Hammer behind, you would expect that because it's an AoE ability. This is for single target. As soon as I've got 2 targets in there, it does twice as much damage. As soon as I've got 3, it does 3 times as much. Not far behind Virtue's Blade at the moment, though. And of course, Blade of Wrath ahead. But that's because Blade of Wrath's damage has effectively been done now. Now, on to the next one. There are other sources of damage from these as well, indirect source of damage. Blade of Justice generates 2 holy power. Thank goodness now they all generate 2 holy power. That makes this a lot simpler. So, in a single target situation, we would spend that on Templar's Verdict. So, we can say that that 2 holy power is the equivalent of 2/3 of a Templar's Verdict. So again, I've assumed it's 2/3 of a Templar's Verdict divided by the cooldown time. Now that includes the cooldown time for Divine Hammer this time, because we get that 2 holy power every time we press the button. We are also assuming that we're using this ability off cooldown, as we will throughout this. Finally, there's an extra amount of damage from Virtue's Blade in the form of crit, because instead of doing double damage, crits do triple damage. So I've had to add on an extra little bit for the extra crit. I haven't incorporated crit into any of these values, of course, because your crit, that depends on your crit rate, and that's going to vary from person to person. But I do have to take account for it for Virtue's Blade. I can't just ignore it just because it's going to be different for different people. Obviously, I've had to use my crit rate, which on the beta at the moment is... Ooh, sorry, let me just check. 18%. So adding all that up, I get DPS values of about 26.5k for Virtue's Blade, you know, just under 29k for Blade of Wrath, and just over 20k for Divine Hammer. So Blade of Wrath coming out as the clear winner. But of course, as soon as you've got 2 targets, Divine Hammer's streaking ahead. Now bear in mind that these have not finished being tuned yet. I'm not necessarily even expecting them to stay like this, but this is what we're looking like at the moment. Of course, Virtue's Blade, if you get significantly more crit, and crit is looking quite tasty for Legion, then of course it could be much higher, and in which case Virtue's Blade will win out over Blade of Wrath. So then let's have a look at Crusader Strike. 3 versions of Crusader Strike as well. We've got our baseline Crusader Strike if we took Greater Judgment. Greater Judgment, you might think, okay, for trash that would be quite good. Yes, it probably would. But then for it's an all or nothing thing. For bosses, it's almost useless. It's really almost useless for bosses. So I'm not minded to take that. But I've included it anyway for completeness. This is a nice simple calculation. They're all physical damage dealers. So at the moment, I could just say, okay, well, it does this amount of damage. Divide it by the time to get a DPS value. However, Fires of Justice has an effect whereby it has a 20% chance to proc and cause your next Holy Power spender to cost 1 Holy Power fewer. Now, if it's going to save you 1 Holy Power, I'm going to call that, in terms of damage, it's worth about 1/3 of a Templar's Verdict, 20% of the time. And of course, that's holy damage. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to reduce the values to take account of armor, so that we're talking in holy power equivalent, so that I can make meaningful assessments here. Now, what happens is, if we look at Crusader Strike, so this is DPS values, it's way below the other 2, as might be expected. Then we look at Fires of Justice and Zeal. Now, they're not miles apart. Fires of Justice looks very slightly ahead. But two things. First of all, this is single target. Second of all, this assumes that we're using them off cooldown. Now, I'm just going to double check what my haste is on this Paladin. It's 16%. Now, that may or may not get higher quite quickly as soon as we're really leveling our character up, gearing up, I should say, rather. The other thing to point out here is I'm ignoring the extra charge we get. Obviously, there is an extra charge here, and that will favour Fires of Justice slightly because, again, shorter recharge time. So just taking the single target aspect alone, as soon as we have a second target, Zeal will do an extra amount of damage equal to 40%, as long as we have to build up the charges. And then it will do that to, like, potentially 3 other targets. So in an AoE situation, Zeal is going to win out, no question. But the important point to note is it's not very far behind on single target. So what I would be taking, and again, bearing in mind what I said before, I'd be thinking in terms of Zeal is clearly better on trash, and it's only slightly behind on single target. Now, but here's the thing. Let's say you still want to go, no, I want to go boss, I want to go single target. You'd look at these two and you would say, well, I'm going to go for Blade of Wrath and Fires of Justice. Well, I've tried this combination with my 16% haste, and I cannot use them off cooldown. The rotation is too rapid, I find personally. Especially once you've got your Wake of Ashes mixed in, which is the ability you get on your Ashbringer, which is every 30 seconds, so it's not all the time. Remembering that Judgment has to be top priority. You want to use Judgment off cooldown. And these calculations assuming we're using our Crusader Strike and Blade of Justice off cooldown. Well, we can't use them all as top priority. We have to decide on a priority. And what my experience is that when we use Blade of Wrath and Fires of Justice, we will find ourselves not hitting these abilities on cooldown because they come off cooldown just too quickly. So what I did is I went into a dungeon, Darkheart Thicket, which I sort of got in the background there, and I tried out taking Divine Hammer and Zeal. Now what you notice, and I've got the logs below as well, is on who I was with in this party, by the way. There was a Frost Death Knight who had rolled on the PvP realm. Now what that meant was it was a pre-made level 110, and the artifact was fully traded, so it had all the traits. Not necessarily any relics in the weapon though, so their weapon item level might have been a little bit behind their overall item level. There was a Demon Hunter DPS, as well as a Demon Hunter tank. They were on PvE realms, so they would have leveled just as I have. You can also see on the logs the difference in item levels if you want to judge that as well. Now, what I found was, on trash, sometimes I did pretty well, and mostly with DP procs where I was Divine Storming to buggery. And sometimes I didn't do at all well. It's very variable AoE in like burst AoE for Retribution, I find. But when it came to bosses, it was a different story. Even though I was taking what in theory was not the best options for either talent for single target, nonetheless I was able to win out with these abilities. So it's certainly based on this one not looking at all bad. Based on the calculations, it does. You know, you look at it and you think, well, that's not too bad. All right, Divine Hammer is significantly worse on single target. At the same time, the Blade of Justice itself is a small amount of damage compared to your Templar's Verdicts, and it's generating holy power, not at the same rate, but it is still generating it reasonable. I mean, if you look at the difference between the fastest Blade of Wrath, which for me is 6.05 second cooldown, and Divine Hammer 8.64 second cooldown, so there's like 2.5 seconds between them, okay, which you might think over the course of a fight is going to be significant. But again, remember what I said before, I find it very difficult to use all these things when I take the quicker options off cooldown because there's just so much to use. and with more haste it's just going to get more difficult. On a last little note, just before I finish off, Divine Storm. Now, one thing I mentioned regarding Divine Storm, because when they've changed the judgment, which I noted in the sort of PTR and beta update I did a few days ago, it cleaves now to a second target baseline, which sounds really good because the obvious use of that is to be able to use Divine Storm on 2 targets. Great. But when the pre-patch goes live and on the PTR, as that's reflected, that's not going to be the case. The Divine Storm is not going to be a DPS increase until 3 targets. So then I thought to myself, okay, well, it's probably that we just need the Divine Storm traits on the Ashbringer. And it is that, but it's a bit more than I thought. There are 2 types of trait that increase your Divine Storm on the Ashbringer. One of them is quite quick to get. One of them is going to take quite a long time to get. And I've tested it on this level 110, and I have the ones that are quite quick to get. That in itself is not enough to make it a DPS increase on 2 targets. You need both of them, because I went onto the PvP realm and made one with a fully upgraded artifact, and yeah, it is a DPS increase on 2 targets. So what I'm going to say on that one is, for the foreseeable future, we're going to say it's going to be a DPS increase on 3 targets. I don't think that's something that's going to change with tuning, and the reason is because if they tuned it to be a DPS increase on 2 targets without the Ashbringer, once we've got the Ashbringer fully traded, it would obviously do far too much damage. So I think it's going to stay like this. So we will not get Divine Storm doing on 2 target cleave until we've virtually got our artifact fully upgraded, and that's going to be several months after Legion. So I hope that was useful. As I said before, I am going to do an update each week now for, well, I'll do an update each week. If nothing changes, it'll just be an all-in-one update. If lots of things change, I'll probably do a separate one for PTR and beta again. And hopefully within about a week and a half, the new guide will come out. After then, it makes a lot more sense for me to carry on doing weekly updates, because if they change anything that I've said in the guide, I will need to update that anyway, won't I? Oh my God. And just a reminder, as soon as they announce the date for the pre-patch, and a lot of people are thinking in terms of like the 19th of July because that was leaked. But of course, even if it was a genuine leak, they could always just change it just for the hell of it. So we don't know yet. But as soon as that date is announced, I will announce the date when I'm going to do a live Q&A on Twitch, which will be aiming for a day or 2 before it goes live, just to go through questions that people have been asking about it, and so people can ask other questions live as well, so that everyone feels ready for that. So as always, hope you found it useful. If you did, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Share it with other people you think might be interested. And until next time, I'll see you later.